chaos descended into my world unannounced. Her spark was exhilarating and captivating and unnerving. It was a flurry of sights and smells and sounds and emotions that flooded my young heart and mind. In many ways, I had been expecting chaos for my whole life, wondering what she would be like and what I would be like when she came. And in many ways, every day of my 23 years up until that point was a kind of mini rehearsal for this moment of chaos. I was 23 years old and my job was the commander of the Presidential Salute Battery in the 3rd U.S. Infantry, one of the most storied infantry units, the oldest infantry unit in the U.S. Army. And we had 2 missions. The first mission, the most prominent, was we fired the 21-gun salutes for the President of the United States and arriving dignitaries. We would do missions on a weekly basis at Andrews Air Force Base or the White House or in funerals in Arlington National Cemetery. We had old guns from World War II that were shined to a pristine black and chrome finish. Our work was precise. Our uniforms were pressed every day on a steam press with every metal aligned perfectly. We were toy soldiers on display for all of America to see. But we had a second mission, and that mission was to protect the National Capital Region in the event of a catastrophic event or an invasion or an attack of some kind. We never really expected to execute that second half of our mission. Mostly we were fixated on being the toy soldier. But still we trained and we prepared for that reality that we thought would never come. I remember that it was a Tuesday, and it was an unremarkable Tuesday morning. I woke up in bed next to my wife at that point of 2 years. I rolled out of bed, and in the Army, you have 2 kinds of days. You have sleeves up days and sleeve down days. We wore battle dress uniforms, the camouflage uniforms with the black shined leather boots. And on most days, it was a sleeves up day. That meant you rolled your sleeves up and you went and you did office work or maintenance work before and after our ceremonial missions. But I remember that Tuesday was a sleeves down kind of day. And that meant we were about to have some fun. A sleeves down day meant that we got to be real soldiers. It was an early wake up. It was 4 a.m. and I started it like I started almost every day in that job, in that season of life, with a Stanley thermos of Folgers hazelnut coffee. With my sleeves down battle dress uniform, I loaded into my teal Ford F-150 with a purple camper shell on the back. And I headed down I-95 from our house in Woodbridge to Fort Myer, Virginia, which was positioned right in Arlington, next to Arlington National Cemetery, just outside of Washington, D.C. And I met up with my platoon, and we loaded into our 2.5-ton trucks and several other vehicles, and we set out for Fort A.P. Hill, which was a training installation about 40 miles south. And that day we were excited because we didn't have to play toy soldier. That day we got to blow things up. And that's why 23-year-olds join the Army, is to blow things up and play in the woods with their friends. And that's what we got to do that day. And so with my hazelnut coffee in hand, I loaded in the truck and led the convoy south. And I remember we got to the range. We were firing AT-4, which are shoulder-fired weapon systems, and we had 100 of them. And I remember that meant that every single guy in the platoon could shoot 2. And so there was a lot of excitement and commotion as the guys piled out of the trucks, and some lit up cigarettes and started talking, and the non-commissioned officers began to set up the range. And I remember there was a brand new crane that was set in the middle of the field, and the crane would be the target for us that day. Our goal in life would be to blow up that crane into as many pieces as humanly possible with our AT-4 rockets. And so with great anticipation, we set up the range. And I remember the first guy went up and fired the first volley into the crane, and it cracked with a loud explosion, and a piece of the crane blew off into the field and set a piece of the field on fire. And you just heard shouts of jubilation come out from the young soldiers. We thought, this is why we're in the Army. This is going to be a great day. Well, soon after that first volley of fire, my radio operator who was sitting in the Humvee called out to me, "Lieutenant Smith, come over here. Range control needs to talk to you on the radio." And so I jogged over to the Humvee parked just behind the firing line. And I jumped into the front seat and I picked up the radio and talked to range control. And they said, "Lieutenant Smith, we've received a call from your regiment at Fort Myer, and something's happened, and you need to shut down the range, and you need to return back to Fort Myer immediately." And I remember feeling frustrated and actually a little bit angry because I didn't have any information at that point. I just knew that I was going to have to communicate something to my soldiers that they wouldn't want to hear, that our day of fun had come to an end. And so with lots of murmuring, they loaded everything up, and we got back in the trucks, and we began the drive back to Fort Myer. And I'll never forget that we pulled onto I-95, and at first it was a normal drive back, but I remember as we approached the interchange at Springfield, all of a sudden the traffic was backed all the way up. And if you've been to Washington, D.C., you know that often there's traffic on the road, but at that time of the day, there shouldn't have been that kind of traffic going into the city. And it was backed up for miles, bumper to bumper. But I had received a message that I was to return to base as quickly as possible. So I remember I jumped out of my Humvee and I walked along the side of the highway and motioned for the vehicles in the convoy to follow me. And I led them on foot around the traffic, moving cars out of the way until we reached the very end of the lines of cars. And I remember there was a sheriff's barricade, a state trooper's barricade along the highway, stopping all the traffic going into Washington, D.C. And I walked up to the state trooper in charge and I said, "Hey, officer, what's going on?" And he said, "Hey, I don't know, Lieutenant, but there's been some kind of incident at the Pentagon, and I think you better get to where you're going pretty fast." And so I loaded back in my Humvee, and I'll never forget driving past that barricade, because as we headed around the corner and we began to see the first glimpses of Washington, D.C., there was a huge plume of smoke, and we were the only vehicles on the road on both sides of the highway. And I remember there was an F-16 jet that flew nap of the earth right over all the buildings, shaking our vehicles. It looked like a literal war zone. And remember, at this time in September of 2001, there was no cell phones. At least we didn't have them. All we had was our radio, and we didn't have access to the news, and we didn't know what was going on. But returning back to our capital, it looked like we were at war, and we were. As we pulled into Fort Myer, I pulled into the road behind our barracks, and the Fulberg Colonel, regimental commander of our unit, 3 levels above me, was standing, waiting for me to return. And as soon as I opened my door, he grabbed me by the shoulder and he said, "Lieutenant Smith, there's been some kind of an incident, explosion at the Pentagon, and I need for you to take your trucks and your men, and I need you to get over there and find out how the old guard can help. And you should be prepared to be gone for 3 days because we don't know what's happened. And so be ready for whatever they ask you to do." So quickly, I made a hasty plan and briefed my non-commissioned officers, and they began to gather up supplies. And as I walked into our day room, I remember looking at the television set in there, and I saw the burning Twin Towers, and that was the first time that I saw the glimpse of what was happening in the world around us. But I hadn't begun to put the picture together. And we loaded in our trucks, And we headed to the Pentagon as we had so many times before. And as we rounded the corner and we came to the road where we would normally drive in, we saw complete destruction. We saw fire like we had never seen it before. The fence around the Pentagon was completely knocked down to the ground. The lampposts on the highway were knocked down, and we drove our trucks right over the down fence and onto the lawn. And people were running everywhere in every direction, and there was smoke and there was fire and there was chaos, and it seemed like no one was in charge. And so I instructed my men to stay in the trucks while I went and figured out what was going on and how we might help. And I remember as I got out of my truck and I approached the building, which by the way was so hot that you couldn't get within 100 yards of the building because it was melting steel at that point. A general officer ran up to me, his shirt torn, his clothes singed by the fire. He grabbed me by the shoulders and he said, "Lieutenant, we're glad you're here and we need your help. We need you to save people inside of the building." And he pointed towards the gaping hole where the side of the Pentagon had once stood. And so I went and I found an engineering unit that was set up, ready to do recovery operations, ready to go and try to save people, survivors inside of the building. And they had stretchers and ropes and all the equipment to get inside of the building. And I met up with that captain and we made a plan that he could use my soldiers and our help. And I went back to the trucks and I got our soldiers. And we went and we grabbed the stretchers and we grabbed the ropes. And I remember we sat and kneeled and we watched as the center of military power for the greatest military on the face of the planet in the history of the world burned to the ground. And we waited, hoping that we could be part of saving someone's life. But the fire was too hot. And all night we watched it burn, and we watched the fire trucks, many fire trucks, douse the building with tens of thousands of gallons of water. And somewhere just before dawn, someone in charge came to our little vagabond party of engineers in my little platoon and said, "Guys, we have a mission for you, and we need you to build a giant Jenga set pylon to support the building," and pointing to the part of the building where at that point we had learned a hijacked aircraft had come over and skipped on the ground and crashed into the side of the Pentagon, exploding, killing everyone on board and killing hundreds inside of the Pentagon. And at that crash site, there was part of the building that was destroyed at the bottom, and the rest of the upper floors were at risk of further collapse. And so we went while parts of the building were still on fire, and the engineers provided the construction expertise, and we've provided the brawn, and we built a support system to support the building. And I'll never forget standing there in that moment, the building on fire, the smell of smoke and burned bodies. It was palpable. And if I think about it too much, I'm back into that moment. And I remember as we were approaching that site to build the pylons, I looked around the corner and I could see a body burned and laying just outside of our reach. We would find out later there were hundreds of bodies just inside of that gaping hole. Even though my whole life had been a rehearsal for this moment, nothing could have prepared me for what I experienced that day. I was 23 years old, and I woke up that morning thinking, this is another great day in the Army. This is another normal day. I'll be home at 5 o'clock tonight to have dinner with my wife. But I didn't go home. And instead, my nation called upon me to do a difficult task and to lead other men in doing that difficult task. And we did it well. And the next morning, I led the very first platoon of soldiers into the building. Now the fire was out, but the building was waist deep in some areas in jet fuel and water and body parts and wreckage and debris from the airplane. And we went into the building to survey the damage and to begin to make an assessment and a plan. And that day was the beginning of a 3-week deployment to the Pentagon. We didn't go home for 3 weeks. We lived in tents on the lawn. And every night we donned a white Tyvek suits and protective gear and masks, and we entered into that hole of death, and we cleaned up the debris, and we looked for evidence. It was a crime scene at that point, and we picked up body parts and we put them in body bags. And I remember that even though I was young, some of my soldiers were even younger, and I remember that some of the soldiers couldn't finish the mission. It was too much for them. They were emotionally and mentally exhausted and overwhelmed by the sheer death and destruction that we saw all around us for those 3 weeks. And some couldn't make it and had to get psychiatric help. And I remember thinking, that's strange. What's wrong with these guys? Why can't they just buck up and do the task? But that was because I was a young man without enough life experience, without the capacity to have empathy and vulnerability for others and for what they might be carrying into that same experience. And in that day and in that 3-week period, I learned an important lesson in leadership and in life. And here it is, that chaos is always coming. Sometimes that chaos is global, and sometimes it tears apart your world, and other times it's small and unrecognizable, but chaos is always around the corner, and that's principle number 1. And here's the deal: as we sit here today, as you sit and you think about your life and your leadership, maybe you've had to do something like what I did on September 11th, and maybe you haven't, but here's what I know: if you're in leadership, then you're dealing with chaos. You've dealt with chaos. You've dealt with difficulty. You're leading people. You're dealing with difficult circumstances. You're dealing with circumstances that you didn't imagine, that you didn't ask for, that you didn't dream of, that you don't want to be in. And the question is, how will you navigate it? But the first principle is to remember that chaos is coming. And when we anticipate that reality, it's not that we can prepare for every contingency. And sometimes I think that's the mistake that we make in life and in leadership, is that we try to pre-solve every possible contingency to try to mitigate every risk. But the reality is we can't. There's so much in the world that's outside of our control. And maybe some of you, I know some of you are feeling that right now in your life and in your leadership and in your industry, that there's forces in the world bearing down upon you that you didn't ask for or want. But if we have the posture as leaders to realize chaos is always coming, then what we can do is that we can be resilient, because we can be not surprised when it comes, but we can say, I knew this was coming. I didn't know when, I didn't know what, I didn't know how, but I knew it was coming. And I thought about it, and I prepared not for the individual circumstance, but I prepared my leadership, I prepared my team, and I prepared to lead in a way that would be effective through the chaos. The leader who excels in chaos does 2 things well. The first thing is what we just talked about, that they know chaos is coming. They don't know exactly when, they don't know what, but they anticipate it. They know that if things are going well, it won't be going well for long, and that's okay. That's life, that's leadership, that's the way the world works. And there's something about that anticipation that steels us, that helps us in our leadership. But the second thing, and I think the more powerful thing, is that we're aware of what's in our span of control. Because when chaos comes, there's a deep temptation to try to grab control. And what I learned on the lawn of the Pentagon when I was 23 years old, and I saw the most powerful military on earth and every possible agency in the United States government at that site, and I pulled up with my 40 guys, what I experienced was no one in control. And it was scary, and it was chaotic. But leaders who thrive in chaos are able to recognize what is in their span of control and what's not. And what they recognize is most of life is not in your control. That's a good principle, by the way, for just relationships in general, to recognize we're not really in control of much. But here's the things that we are in control of. We're in control of what we think, and we're in control of what we say. That our thoughts and our words are the most powerful tools that we have in our leadership inventory. So as we sit here today and we think about the chaos of our context and our business and our life, and we think about how do we lead through it, the first thing that I want to talk about is to recognize that what's mainly in our span of control is our thoughts and our words. Have you thought about that before? You see, I think often we're trying to control everything externally, and we exercise the least amount of control internally in the space where we have true agency. And there's a discipline to living in a way that we control our thoughts. Here's a little exercise. When a stressful moment comes, how aware of you about your first inclinations and thoughts? Something I've struggled with deeply in my own leadership journey is that often my initial thought will be a thought of blame. Whose fault is this? But you see, blame doesn't really help anyone. What I've learned is that the right thought to have is to think, what should I do next? A right thought to have is, I wonder how my people are doing. I should go check on them. You can never go wrong in thinking about the welfare of other people. But the second thing is our words. As leaders, we have incredible power with our words, especially in a moment of chaos. When the world is on fire, literally or figuratively, all eyes will be on you. And you see, if your thinking is disrupted by blame or shame or fear, and you haven't gotten control of that, then it's impossible for your words to then be life-giving in a way that's going to be helpful to those you're leading. But if you can grab control of your thoughts, reject blame, shame, and fear, and embrace thinking about what to do next, about thinking about other people, then that can translate into words that can begin to give direction and life and solutions to others. So I just wanted to invite you to think about the moment of chaos that maybe you're in right now, or if you're not in one now, think about one that you've just come through, and maybe do a little critique of yourself. How would you grade yourself on your thinking? How would you grade yourself on the words that you spoke? Were they words of life? Were they words of forward movement? Were they words of inspiration? Or were they words that emanated from a place of blame, shame, and fear? You see, the cold, hard truth is that I can only really control my thoughts and my words. You know, there's a second principle as we're thinking about how to navigate the inevitable chaos that will surely descend upon us at any given moment. And that principle is that, and this is a little counterintuitive, but the principle is that we need to think small, that we need to get small. What do I mean by that? You see, chaos is inherently disruptive, and it's confusing, and it's disorienting. And there's a leadership skill that I call zoom in and zoom out. And we have to be adept as leaders at zooming in and zooming out. What do I mean? That in any given moment, we have to know whether it's appropriate and helpful to zoom in at precision and details, or to zoom out and to look at the bigger picture. But what I've learned in the dynamic of zooming in and zooming out is that when chaos is erupting all around us, the worst thing we can do is to zoom out and to start to project bigger fears and bigger problems and more chaos and more confusion into the situation. What does that look like? I think often when we fail to get small, to think small, it looks like this. As we begin to ask the question, what if? What if it's worse than we thought? What if the worst case situation actually comes to bear? What will happen? Or we make the problem even bigger than the one that's actually presenting itself. But you see, to navigate chaos effectively, we have to think small, we have to get small, we have to zoom in on the actual problem at hand for us and for our teams, and we have to think about, what is it that I can do next? What is it I can solve right now? And as we think about getting small, I want to tell a story from an experience that I had prior to September 11th. It was during my training. I was in the U.S. Army Ranger School, which is a 62-day suck fest where the object is to simulate the stress of combat to train leaders for war. And they simulate combat stress by depriving you of food and of sleep. And then they put you in challenging leadership positions, and you have to lead each other, and you take turns rotating through leadership assignments, sleep deprived, food deprived. And by the end of the 62-day course, you're in what's called the Florida phase, which is in the swamps outside of Eglin Air Force Base. And as I think about this lesson of learning to get small and not make problems bigger, but smaller in a moment of chaos, I think about one of my last patrols that I was called to lead in the Florida phase of Ranger School. It was nighttime, and the mission was to cross over the intercoastal waterway in black Zodiac rafts, blacked out with night vision goggles, and we were doing a training assault on Santa Rosa Island. And as we paddled across in the darkness, we began to see the shadows of the island. And as we came up on the beach, the men in the boats were so tired and disoriented, they began to wander off in all directions. And at that point, I was just a soldier. I wasn't in charge. I wasn't the platoon leader. I wasn't the leader of the mission. And I remember getting out of the boat, sopping wet, and lying down in the sand in the prone position, pulling security, and just waiting for the next order to come in this mission. And then just a few minutes after landing, one of the Ranger instructors came and grabbed me by the shoulder, and he jerked me up. And coming up to my feet in a stupor, I remember he said, "Ranger Smith, you're now in charge. You're the platoon leader of this next part of the mission. Get your men together and go carry out the assault on the island." And so in that moment, I watched as the men were wandering off in different directions. Some were falling asleep. Some were wandering back into the water. The boats were untied and began to go out back into the intercoastal waterway. It was total chaos. But one of the things I learned through the Ranger School experience is to get small. And in that moment, not to make the situation bigger, not to get upset, but to think about, what is the next right problem to solve? And so I focused on my training, and I went and got my subordinate leaders, and I got them together, and I made a hasty plan to get the men organized, to get the boats secured, step one. And then I did a map check and set us out on a course to our objective on the island. And in that moment, the training kicked in, and getting small worked one step at a time, and ignoring my own sleep deprivation and food deprivation in that moment. It wasn't a pity party. It wasn't a fear party. It wasn't a shame party. It was a get it done party. It was time to get about our business. It was time to provide purpose and direction and motivation. And I remember that mission was successful, and I never forgot that lesson. And so 2 years later, as I found myself in a different situation on the lawn of the Pentagon, the training kicked in once again. And the training said, don't make the problem bigger, make it smaller. Hone in on just the right problem to solve, and provide the purpose and direction and motivation that your people need to succeed.